This morning's parasha tells us of our obligation to not only have a system of justice with the appropriate judges and officers, but also of our obligation to do justice. The words tzedek, tzedek tirdof from the opening lines of our parsha, meaning justice, justice shall you pursue, have become the well-known standard for these obligations. So I want to share with you a very true story, which is a tragic example of a miscarriage of justice and of the failure to achieve justice. But at the same time, this story also shows how one person did in fact pursue justice at great personal cost, and why we should and can never give up on our fight to achieve justice. The story I'm talking about is the story of Leo Frank. There we go. The subject of the Broadway musical Parade, which I spoke about back in June after seeing it. It is fitting to bring it up now, as the 118th anniversary of his lynching was 2 days ago on August 17th, and his yurtzeit is coming up this week on Thursday, the 7th of August. So in case you've forgotten or never knew the story, let me briefly, or not so briefly, share it with you. Leo Frank was a Jewish man from Brooklyn who moved to Atlanta to be the manager of a pencil factory. On April 26th of 1913, the body of a young girl named Mary Fagan was discovered in the basement of the factory. She had been raped and murdered. Suspicion immediately focused on Leo Frank, the New York Jew, who was arrested even though there was no real evidence against him. His trial was filled with anti-Semitic fervor, including the crowds outside who shouted, "Kill the Jew," and editorials in local Atlanta newspapers. And despite the lack of evidence against him, including coerced and perjured testimony from the black factory sweeper, who history has shown was the real killer, Leo Frank was convicted of the murder and sentenced to death. Frank's appeals all the way to the Supreme Court were denied. In fact, Oliver Wendell Holmes would have reversed his conviction. But on August 17th of 1915, a mob broke into his prison cell, took Frank from his bed, drove him to Marietta, and lynched him, proclaiming to carry out the legitimate sentence imposed by the state of Georgia. Many of those involved in the kidnapping, in the lynching, including a former governor of Georgia, were never charged, despite the authorities knowing who they were. So why did this happen? Because after all the appeals were exhausted, there was only one more avenue left. And that was an appeal to Georgia's governor, John Slayton, to commute Leo Frank's sentence. Let me just go there. Here we go. Here we go. John Slayton, who you've probably never heard of, was the epitome of our commandment of tzedek, tzedek tirdof, as well as a profile in courage. Slayton had been elected in 1912, and his term was set to expire 4 days after Frank's scheduled execution. He could have left well enough alone, but he chose not to. He visited the crime scene, got witnesses to admit that they were coerced or lied, reviewed over 10,000 pages of documents and letters, including one written by the original trial judge who expressed his second thoughts and also asked Slayton to commute the sentence. Slayton received more than 1,000 death threats. He was promised that he would be made a United States Senator if he just let things alone. Nevertheless, John Slayton acted in accordance with his conscience and commuted Frank's sentence to life imprisonment. He said, quote, 2,000 years ago, another governor washed his hands and turned a Jew over to a mob. For 2,000 years, that governor's name has been accursed. If today another Jew were lying in his grave because I had failed to do my duty, I would all through my life have blood on my hands and would consider myself an assassin through cowardice. Feeling as I do about the case, I would be a murderer if I allowed this man to hang. I would rather be plowing in a field than to feel the rest of my life that I had that man's blood on my hands. Or, in the words of Sally Slayton in Parade, I would rather be a wife to a fine ex-governor than first lady to a chicken. Or in the words of the Torah, tzedek, tzedek, tirdaf. The public and the press, as you can imagine, were outraged. Effigies of Governor Slayton were hung, and he was burned as the king of the Jews. Thousands of armed protesters gathered outside his home. And when the new governor was sworn into office, he and Slayton emerged from the Capitol building, and a workman attempted to crush Slayton's skull with an iron bar. Thankfully, the quick action of a member of his staff saved his life. Slayton and his wife, after this incident, had to leave Georgia, and they stayed away for 10 years. It's believed that he spent 3 of those years in Romania working for the Red Cross during World War I. Well, John Slayton did return to Georgia. He continued to practice law and attempted to re-enter politics. And although near the end of his career he received a few honors, he still remained a pariah to the many Georgians who could not forget what he did to Leo Frank. But he understandably remains a hero to this day to the Jews of Atlanta who know his story. Sean Allen Krill is the actor who played Governor Slayton in the Broadway musical. He had traveled to Atlanta, and while there, he stopped by the memorial on the site where Leo Frank was lynched. Right over there. And this is what he had to say about his experience. The more research I've done, the more enamored I've become. The truth is, he was much less conflicted about commuting Leo's death than is purely depicted in the play. But in reality, granting Leo Frank clemency was his, as he says, a plain case of duty. In a statement that he wrote right before he died in 1955, Slayton said, "I did what my sense of justice and my conscience demanded that I do. The effect of my action upon my political future was not a matter to which I paid any attention, and I did my duty under the facts. I practiced law in Atlanta with a clear conscience, and I would not have changed my action." The actor Sean Allen Krill continued, "It breaks my heart that every night that Slayton's attempt to save Leo Frank's life ultimately failed. But he did what he could at great cost to save an innocent man's life. His ethical, legal, and moral obligation as a public servant, a lawyer, and a human being. A fine example of what our current political representatives could and should strive for. Or in other words, a fine example of living up to the ideals of our Torah of tzedek, tzedek, tirdaf. But the Leo Frank story is not over yet, because the story and the injustice continued. After Frank's lynching, around half of Georgia's 3,000 Jews left the state. And according to author Stephen Olney, what it did to Southern Jews can't be discounted. It drove them into a state of denial about their Judaism. They became even more assimilated, anti-Israel, Episcopalian. The temple did away with chuppahs at weddings or anything that would draw attention to their Judaism. And for many years thereafter, many people, including the ADL, which, by the way, was formed in the aftermath of Leo Frank's lynching, have been trying to clear Leo Frank's name. In 1982, a man named Alonzo Mann, who had been Frank's office boy at the time of the murder, told a newspaper that he had witnessed another factory employee, a man named Jim Conley, carrying Mary Fagan's body down to the basement. This led ADL and some attorneys to appeal to the Georgia State Board of Pardons to pardon Leo Frank. The board denied the pardon in 1983, concluding that it was impossible to conclusively decide the guilt of innocent of Leo Frank. For the board to grant the pardon, the innocence had to be shown conclusively, to which the lead editorial in the Atlanta Constitution began, "Leo Frank has been lynched for a second time." But remember, tzedek, tzedek, tirdaf. We do not give up in the face of injustice. Frank's supporters continued to submit pardon applications, and finally, in 1986, the Georgia Board of Pardons granted Leo Frank a pardon. Why? Not because he was innocent, but because of the state's failure to protect him and to preserve his opportunity for legal appeal. So yes, even in 1986, the state of Georgia could still not admit that Leo Frank was not guilty. Fast forward to 2019, the then Fulton County District Attorney convened an 8-member panel to investigate Leo Frank's case. The board's task was to re-examine it and make a recommendation whether it should be adjudicated or not. It's 4 years later, and we're still waiting. And finally, you might be interested to know that Leo Frank is buried in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale, Queens. At the bottom of his footstone are 2 Latin words, semper idem, which means always the same. Always the same. Yes, anti-Semitism is always the same, even in America. But our obligation is to make sure that always the same is no longer the same, and to seek justice in the face of injustice for Jew and non-Jew alike, an obligation which we have carried with us from biblical times through today. So let us always be mindful of our obligation to pursue justice as we recall with sadness the lynching of Leo Frank, and as we embody the courage and righteousness of Governor John Slayton. And let this tragic story of our past inspire us to always live by the biblical commandment of tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Shabbat shalom.
Yasher Koach.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi.
Thank you.